This is Identity at the Center. If it has anything to do with IAM, this is the go-to podcast. So if you're a beginner or an expert or anyone in between, you've found your new home. Welcome to Identity at the Center. Now your hosts, Jim McDonald and Jeff Stedman.
Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff. How are you?
Not so bad. Yourself?
Good. You're laughing because you see me smiling because you know I got something funny.
Something.
And,
well, I don't know if it's funny. You've been on a roll of a whole bunch of downers recently, so hopefully it's funny.
Yeah. Well, I think this one's kind of funny. So I normally don't do this, but I mean, everybody knows this is the Trust and Identity Talk with Eve Mailer. So Eve and I got together a little bit earlier to talk about what we're going to talk about. And we came up with an idea, which is that everybody's going to think we're going to talk about zero trust, right, as part of trust and identity. And we came up with a drinking game idea. So anytime someone says zero trust on this episode, you've got to do a shot.
But if we're not talking zero trust, drink, then nobody's going to be drinking. Or is that the intent?
Well, the idea is that I think somebody's going to say at some point. But yeah, I mean, the intent, probably best thing for you is not to be doing shots because I asked you about what you're going to do tonight. And by the way, it is Friday, so it's Friday night. And you're going to be working on statements of work. So
yeah, it's a fun Friday.
Be doing shots.
Yeah, I'm currently in Boston, still recording from a hotel room. And yeah, I will be working on lovely statements of work, which is a good thing, right? That means that, people are engaging with us to do stuff. Not going to complain about that. Not the most exciting Friday, but that's fine. And then I fly home Saturday, and then I think I turn around and fly back out on Tuesday. So I've got a pretty busy schedule actually for travel. I think I'm on the road every week until the end of March right now. And for
You're
those
a
listening,
traveling man.
Yeah, I am a traveling man, and right now today is February 17th. So I think when this goes out, it'll be a couple weeks later. But that's part of the reason why I'm traveling so much, is we're recording kind of around that travel schedule. So good times.
Yeah. I was gonna make a comment about your background being so cool for a hotel. Like most hotels don't have ceilings that look like that. It looks like you're at a ski lodge or something. But it made me reflect on. I was on a couple calls this week with identity access management professionals, and it seems like 50% of people in identity and access management play instruments, primarily the guitar. And I mean, what better guest to have on the podcast than Eve Mailer when we're going to talk about, playing rock and roll and doing identity and access management?
Yeah, of ZZ Off fame. So, it's cool to have her on, and she can bring her golden pipes, I think, to the episode. Before we get to that, we're going to be at Gartner in a couple weeks, right? So we're going to be on stage and hopefully having a very interesting and different show than maybe people are used to at Gartner when we talk with Enrique and Becky. Any thoughts on how you think that's going to go?
I think it's going to go fantastic. I mean, a lot of the questions that the community have already sent our way are really good. I think what you pointed out in an earlier episode, which was the idea that a lot of the questions are coming from the same angle. So we're going to have to combine those because we only have a half hour on stage. So we can't ask 20 questions. But if we get 3 or 4 or 5 really good questions, I think it'll be fantastic. And then of course,
hard questions too, not just softballs.
Right, exactly. Yeah, not like we do on the podcast, right? But it's going to be more like meet the press. No, I mean, of course, professional, of course, but
diplomatic, right? All that stuff, but
all that good stuff.
Hopefully, questions that you haven't heard before, asked and answered, millions of times before in different ways.
Yeah,
I'm trying to be different
about the conference,
but good different.
I'm excited about the conference. I'm also excited about the Identity at the Center community event that we're going to be holding on Tuesday night. So anybody who's a listener of the podcast, a regular listener, want to get out and meet Jeff and I, meet other people who listen to the podcast, please reach out. Make sure that we get you that registration link so you can sign up. I think space is going to be somewhat limited. So
how should they get a hold of you? Send a message on LinkedIn?
I think the best way is send a message on LinkedIn. I mean, we might just throw the the link right on LinkedIn. But I'm a little worried about like that turning into some kind of like spam bot program. We
Well,
wind up
people will
getting like
register and then not
10,000
show up,
registration.
stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly. So all those kind of things. But best case, I think, just reach out to me and you, and you know, anybody who's out there listening to the podcast on a regular basis, we'd like to hear from you anyway.
Yeah, you're personally invited. How about that? All right, why don't we get to our topic, which is trust in identity. We've got Eve Mailer again. She's the Chief Technology Officer at ForgeRock. Welcome back to the show, Eve.
It is such a pleasure to be here, guys. It's and I guess I'm going to see you at Gartner because that's kind of around the corner for me.
Yeah, exciting stuff. And maybe if we get lucky, we might even hear Sabrina, who I hear is traveling with you.
She is currently traveling with me. That's my little Pomeranian Chihuahua miniature poodle pup.
So we'll be lucky if we get to hear that. We always encourage our guests and their pets to come on, and we have yet to have one make a peep on the show. So
yeah,
cats,
now that you
dogs,
said that.
Yeah, now for sure it'll happen, right? Well, so we were looking back into our many archives of shows now, and you have been on the show now 3.5 times. You were way back with us very early on, episode number 48. We talked about UMA. Episode 116, we talked through ForgeRock Consumer Identity Breach Report, which is a really fascinating report. So I'm looking forward to the next one that comes out. And then we did also, obviously today, but the half episode is the one that we did around what is the difference between digital identity and identity and access management. And we asked identity friends, what was their take on it? And you were kind enough to send in a response. And what I want to do now is actually play what you said. And this would have been 50 episodes now, roughly. So almost a year.
You guys are busy.
Yeah, we're nuts over here. So I'm going to play it and let's see what you said. And I'm going to see if has your viewpoint or answer changed. So let me play that clip now.
Identity language has been a contentious subject for a long time. Thinking back to the beginnings of IIW, the Internet Identity Workshop, the original effort by that community was to actually develop a lexicon, a comprehensive lexicon. It was tough going then, and I think it's always tough going in this area. How I see digital identity as a phrase is that it applies to the users of or the interactors with identity technology. And I see IAM as being about the implementation of identity technology in whatever guise. So when it comes to digital identity, the kind of the user perspective, most people interact with identity in a way that actually isn't all that pleasant. Identity theft is probably the first thing that comes to mind. And a lot of times that interaction is actually in an offline fashion versus an online runtime authentication, for example, fashion. When it comes to IAM, that term itself is a bucket for a lot of other different things, and sometimes they overlap with IAM, and sometimes they're maybe a little bit apart. So identity management, kind of life cycle considerations, access management, really all the runtime considerations, and also governance and administration, which gets into the world of really operational things. And there's this phrase that I really like lately, BOLTS, which is business, operational, legal, technical, and societal. So that's kind of the game that you get into when you talk about both the above the water user considerations and the below the water implementer considerations. One of the things that I find when I just talk with ordinary people out there who don't do what I do about what you could call the jobs to be done of digital identity is that all of the things people expect to get from this sort of technology, it cross-cuts what things businesses want as well. I have a new Venn diagram about this where I think in terms of protection and personalization and payment and people. So there are unique needs among all of those categories, and they cross-cut quite a lot of things. Like achieving security is actually something that's welcomed by people and by businesses. It applies across all of the identity language.
Okay, so a couple of things there, Eve. One, I love that you called other people ordinary people, not weirdos in the identity space. Second of all, has your thoughts on, what you said there changed at all, evolved, or do you still think they hold true?
I still represent those remarks, I suppose I would say. My understanding of the distinction between kind of the user perspective and the implementer perspective has deepened since that time. Um, you guys know I run the innovation labs here at ForgeRock, and I've been working with this great team, and all last year we were putting together kind of a fully articulated long-term vision so that we could be the change we want to see in the world for our customers and for their users. And the topics all broke out really neatly into identity users and identity implementers. And I think empathizing with users and interactors um, is something we can obviously do more of. It's one of the toughest things to do. And when I go out to speak with our customers who are, they tend to be large enterprises, um, many of them have visions for the next 100 years because some of them have been around the 100 years, and here they are doing digital transformation and everything. They kind of they do care a lot about the implementation, right? They want to do that right, but the reason they do it is for all the people who interact, whether it's workforce or consumer or whatever. So I kind of find the split useful in my daily job.
Well, that's good. So we're still on the same path. I thought what was interesting about that clip was, and I still say to this day, when we got all the answers back, it seemed like everybody in the identity space had a different answer.
And I liked them all, right? I listened to them.
Yeah.
Like, well, that's good. That's good. No, I agree with that one. Oh, well, if I force ranked them, no, I don't want to force rank them.
Well, that's the interesting part, right? It was nobody was wrong. Like I felt like everybody was right. And I think that sometimes, speaks to maybe the complexity sometimes and the nuance that gets lost in identity conversations, and that the context matters. And, where do what is your definition of digital identity compared to IAM, right? That was the question. And everyone's got a different viewpoint on it. What I did find interesting was the one person who sent in their response, Adam from Texas A&M. He's not an identity vendor, reseller, consultant, right? He's running it in the real world, as I'll call it.
Yep.
Doing identity for real things. And he had a totally different answer than everyone else. Again, not wrong or not right compared to everyone else's, but it was just a totally different definition. So it was fascinating to kind of see, how it all worked out. We're going to talk about trust today. And I think before we get too far along, I'm not going to say the Z word because we're not talking about that. And I don't want anybody to get drunk, pull over the side of the road, do bad things, whatever it may be. And what I'd like to figure out first is, that definition. What are we calling trust? Like, how do you define it to people that you interact with?
It's so tough. I actually had a really good conversation with my bass player back when I was in Seattle about this. He was a psychologist by training, and he defined it as just, sort of feeling like you had a guarantee of somebody's next behavior. And it didn't necessarily mean good behavior. Like, if somebody in your family, constantly got drunk or whatever, and, acted badly, you could trust that they were going to do something, right? And that's not necessarily a good thing. I thought that was interesting. But in our line of work, I think people sort of keep on trying to steer around the word because it just means so many different things to different audiences. We pick different words like assurance, right? So recently, I was speaking, I guess it was at EIC, on what it means to package ethics into a technology stack, and I had found a couple of different definitions, and I think these are my two favorite definitions. One of them comes from Rachel Botsman, she's an expert in digital trust, and she did this TED talk on how we've stopped trusting institutions and started trusting strangers, and her definition was. Trust is a confident relationship to the unknown. And I kind of liked that one because I think, particularly from the perspective of the individuals that we serve, so kind of like those identity users, I think it talks to what they're looking for. They want sort of certainty, some level of certainty. Maybe it harks back to my bass player / psychologist. But there's another definition that I liked, and I like to pair it with it. And this comes from my colleague, Alan Foster, who many folks know. And his definition is trust is shared vulnerability to consequences. And I think this it's important in a certain way. It puts an onus, first of all, on the non-person entities in the equation. You can sort of, okay, if it's shared, or you can even imagine like employee-employer relationship, it has to be shared. That's what contracts try and do. It covers even business to business notions of trust. Um, and it points the way towards figuring out, this is one of my favorite subjects, the incentives in an ecosystem. Because if you can figure out who's invulnerable to consequences, that incentivizes bad behavior. And I was thinking about this a little bit when I was listening to your great podcast with Sarah recently, because you guys were talking about the tension between enabling anonymity online for being able to make comments, for people who are in tough situations, and the desire to authenticate to protect against that invulnerability to consequences. So that's when I like to think about, well, what's the real job to be done here? Thinking of that, product management framework that I mentioned before. You want to ensure the real goal, the quarter-inch hole in the wall versus the quarter-inch drill bit in this situation is ensure everyone has consequences for bad digital behavior. And that includes for people, which is why we authenticate now. But, there's people who are proposing different ways to do that.
So, Eve, anybody who tuned into this podcast hoping to hear about trust between Active Directory domains or something technical like that has probably already stopped the episode, right? We're going to be talking about a different kind of trust. We're not going to talk about zero trust. Drink up.
This will be my third drinking game, by the way. Actually, fourth, because I invented one about passwordless yesterday.
Okay. Well, you're on the right show. So we're going to talk about trust in three different stovepipes, if you will, or three different contexts. So it's trust in the practice of IAM, trust and bias, and trust in IAM vendors. And by the way, you work for one of those, so you're the perfect guest to talk about that. But I think first and foremost, we're going to talk about that trust in the practice of IAM, and how could we not talk about self-sovereign ID and verifiable credentials? I think trust is a major thing that needs to be talked about in those two topics. But why don't you just go ahead and riff? I mean, I know this is something you think a lot about.
I like riffing. I don't play guitar though. Yeah, and you're referring to AD trust, kind of trust domains. People often in our line of work put things into two buckets: technical trust and business trust. And really, what I think decentralized identity tries to do is to sort of marry those in a way. I mean, like I was just talking to folks from the Trust Over IP Foundation, where that's literally what they're trying to do. They have two stacks that unify. That's what they're trying to do. But like even with technical trust in the mix, I can't help but get a little bit philosophical because, if you look way back to kind of like the beginning of the really exciting blockchain conversation, that was my first drinking game. It was about making things, quote, trustless. Some people put it that way. That was kind of how a lot of these conversations started. And that is ironic with respect to that zero thing. Trustless, trust-free, now with zero.
Hey, I got this shot right up to my lips at the moment.
I am so going for a drink. Friday night, I don't write statements of work. I'm just saying, guys. But it sounds like a lot of fun. So decentralized architectures generally are, they're making a pitch for evenly distributing vulnerability to consequences. And I might describe that as, more like resilient mutual trust, right? A better job of mutual trust, something like that. Here's the challenge in decentralized systems. There's always the possibility, indeed, it's kind of the likelihood that over time, sometimes very quickly, you get what I call insidious recentralization, which messes with the incentives in one way or another. So through exchanges, through aggregated services, you look at the crypto world, and you can imagine looking at that in light of decentralized identity, verifiable credentials. And so that verifiable credentials world, it kind of makes a run at being able to trust that something was issued properly, some piece of information was issued by somebody you care about, and you'd say, yeah, I'd go for that, I'd believe that, and also making services more trustworthy. I can't say that without sort of air quotes in this particular show. For example, through a technique of revocation, allowing somebody to like share a piece of data and then pull it back in a technological sense, not making a, right of erasure request. You know what I'm saying? Um, Unfortunately, even sharing a few little pieces of information are very likely to be correlatable. It doesn't take much. And that's a kind of insidious recentralization that it's easy to kind of just sort of skip over in our thinking. So I think we still have a tough road ahead of us in improving things. We have to be very careful how we implement, and very careful how we set up systems, and very careful how we set up ecosystems.
Yeah, how we implement kind of segues into my next question or my next topic, which was really thinking about organizations or IAM practitioners trusting their IDPs. So, whether it's an on prem product or a product in the cloud, to authenticate users and to do it with high levels of certainty that there are systems letting the right people in and not the wrong people. But there's an aspect of configurability. So even in the cloud, you can set your own password policy, things like that. So it's kind of a shared responsibility, right? It's not like, oh, I trust them to do the job for me. There's still some of it that falls back on the practitioner or the organization.
Yeah. So, let me ask: are you thinking about workforce users when you talk about that, or just all kind of any users?
I think it could be any. I think it could be any.
So, obviously, I think the responsibility does go in kind of all directions. And what's interesting is giving choice to end users doesn't have to drain assurance out of a system. That's one of the things that NIST 800-63 can be good for is shared language about, the quality of what, some authentication that's been made, or the quality of all the backing systems. And so I think that you can give choice in that context in a really interesting way. And by the way, giving choice to users is a way of giving them that confidence. And I would say allowing them to trust you, being trustworthy. 'Cause, all anybody really wants is convenience, value, and control. So if you can give them some control, while assuring yourself that, quality hasn't degraded in, how you're testing them, I think that's super powerful. And that's something, it's something we do actually inside ForgeRock, with our own, how we log into our own systems, allows a great deal of choice, including like FIDO authenticators.
So I put the fact that you're going to be on the show out on the ID Pro Slack channel, and friend of the show Simon Moffat, who by the way I'm sure you remember as a former Forge
Oh
Rocker.
yeah. Yeah, he's a
Uh,
friend of ForgeRock too.
yeah, friend of Forge Rock too, and he commented on that topic that I was mentioning, that the user trust of the IDP is an even more interesting question. And so my question is, how do IDPs become more trusted by users? So how do you move that bar, move that line? And thinking of it from a practitioner perspective, I always go down to kind of like the basics. So is this getting to the point of saying that if I have stronger controls, if require things like MFA, now I'm going to increase my level of trust with the user, right? Is that kind of what he's getting at, or is there something beneath the surface?
I thought it was an intriguing question, and really, shout out to Simon for a very intriguing question. I do think, people aren't generally aware of, what an IDP is. They probably don't really know how to spell or capitalize IDP. Um, they do have relationships with service providers. And the service providers might be in an IDP role, might be in an RP role. Um, and the people's relationship with their service providers in their life, it's kind of changing, and people are getting more suspicious, cynical, savvy. And I had a great opportunity to do a white paper along with OneTrust. And one of the stats that we were quoting from there, this is from a couple of years ago. Edelman is the PR agency, huge PR agency, and it does this annual trust barometer, which seems relevant to this conversation. And so, from a couple of years ago, they found that 60% of the respondents were saying that their default tendency is to distrust something until they see evidence that is trustworthy. So that's kind of a number to put to my assertion. And 40% of the respondents said there are brands they love but no longer buy from because they don't trust them. Now, I'm one of those 40%. That's a high plurality, right? A more recent survey from Magna and Ketch found that 74% of respondents highly value data privacy, and this was about 20 percentage points more than other modern ethical issues of the day, like sustainability. And I think it makes sense to me because it can personally affect you, right? It can mess up your life if you can't rely on some of these things. So um, I do think there's a role for how practitioners implement these systems, and there's an awful lot to do with the experience design, which is part of implementation of identity, no question about it. It's also about um, ensuring there's auditability and transparency. Um, for some time now, I've talked about this kind of, I don't know, modern data privacy 2.0 pyramid of things that kind of make up privacy. And at the bottom is data protection. And that's what the original data protection directive in Europe was called. And that's kind of what they meant by privacy. But we piled more stuff on as requirements. So in the modern kind of GDPR and all of its cousins era, data transparency, what you tell people you know about them, what you tell them you want from them, it's becoming equally as important. It's starting to be mandated. And then at that tippy top is data control. What controls do you give people? What choices do you give people? And all of that adds up to um, different kind of knobs and buttons and switches that you can use to engender trust from people.
That was a good question by Simon. I think it very nuanced. I don't want to build him up too much because he also asked if you get royalties on SAML integrations. And I was thinking, how amazing would that be?
That would be amazing, but
we wouldn't be talking to you if you were.
Is like, here, world, here, have a standard. And of course, in 2001, when we finished version 1 of SAML, we're like, here, world, here it is, go use it. You may now begin. And it took till 2005, so I learned a lesson that I live 5 years in the future. But yeah, well, no royalties.
I'm sorry for you, but it's lucky for us because we probably wouldn't be talking if you were or anybody was. And I guess that speaks to just the open source of having open standards, why they're so important, and not locked behind some sort of cost. I think, but. Anyway, I just thought that was funny. That
it's, hat tip to Simon. I did write a book once, co-write a book about SGML, the precursor to XML that we used in SAML and other things, and I did get royalties off of that, and it wasn't enough to retire. And I can assure you, although with the advance, I bought a pool cue. At the time, I was playing a lot of billiards. I'm not good, but that was what I chose to do. And I was working for a company in Ann Arbor, and this was before all the constraints, and I could walk onto a plane with a pool cue and go to Ann Arbor. So
that's kind of cool.
That's my story of royalties.
Yeah, no, that part kind of if you were getting royalties from SAML, it kind of reminds me of that scene in Office Space where Peter's like, the penny tray. Well, that's where people are taking full pennies. I'm only talking about a fraction of a penny. So
yeah, that's all it added up to.
So back on my very simple level of thinking, I think you kind of went way deeper. But I did have a follow up to that, which was I've heard people make the statement that having passwordless somehow makes people feel like it's less secure. I think if somebody thinks it's less secure, that would reduce their trust. So what do you think of that?
I did have some experiences, and this was back when I was at Forrester, and I had some conversations with some financial services folks, and I think certain experiences more recently borne this out as well. Certain folks that you're trying to protect, like high net worth individuals, for example, can become very suspicious if they just sort of silently get into their service. And I had heard of hard tokens, authenticators being used with that specific population, specifically to give them confidence that everything was safe. I do think that it's going to end up being sort of experiential and generational over time. The conversations I used to have with people on planes 10, 15 years ago about what do you do? Well, you end up, you talk with Sarah about
you ever hear of users and passwords? I do that.
And it was like, then you have the conversation about how much you hate passwords. And that kind of still happens now. But more often, I run into people these days who use password managers, who have a password strategy. And I've always likened it to, well, you have a house key strategy, so more people have a password strategy because they see what's going on. They've gotten more savvy about that. And I do think that as those service providers, IDPs, provide visible assurances to a user about, this is the personalization aspect. In the little clip you played, I was talking about this Venn diagram where I've got, protection and personalization and payments and people. It's personalization can be valuable mutually, and ensuring that that person knows that you know who they are and they know who you are, and that actually that helps you build the relationship between you. That's valuable stuff. And so I think there's lots of ways to do that. And passwordless experiences, as we see them in their best expression with a really well orchestrated journey, will give those signals, I think. So I think it's going to be possible to do. I don't know. I was just talking with folks this week saying, how movies started to have this, like modern TVs have this faster frame rate than they used to, and movies start looking really weird. They did it so they can capture sports action, and yet now it makes movies look like, I don't know, bad soap operas. And I really hated that, and sort of argued with my husband about like what frame rate we should set. And
Well, the frame
I'm
rate
over it
is
now.
how you knew you were watching a soap opera, because it was totally different than everything else. I'm a
Although,
high frame rate fanatic. I love 60 frames or more, but I get the purity of a 24 or a 30.
There was also like, I'm thinking of like Monty Python sketches, because they only used film when they went outdoors to to record, so you could tell whether it was an indoors or an outdoor scene just from that. But in any case, my point being, people can get used to the new paradigm, I think. And I think as long as those signals are there presented to them, I mean, authentication is moving to that direction that Bob Blakely called 20 years ago, from authentication to recognition. Being recognized in a non-creepy, respectful fashion is going to become the way of doing things. And I think, I was a skeptic 10 years ago, literally 10 years ago and a couple of months. When I was at Forrester, I wrote a blog post called Kill Your Password Policies, because you remember Matt Honan was on the cover of Wired with the long read that was about how he got hacked and passwords are a nightmare and blah, blah, blah. And that was all true, and it is true. And my reaction then was, I think it's going to be really hard to root out static shared secrets. Really hard. So in service of a better experience, get rid of those stupid password policies that are doing nothing. Bit strength is not helping us, essentially. And now we all know that. NIST took it out of 800-63. And so we're in a better place now, and people have learned. And now we're on to the MFA prompt bombing. So.
But I do have to remind you that Venn diagrams was the original IAM drinking game. So remember
Venn
that?
diagrams. Was there a drinking game around Venn diagrams? How did I miss that one?
No, I'm kind of tongue in cheek saying that, but it was like Venn diagrams were everywhere in like every IAM conference, right? People just love the Venn diagram.
Venn diagrams were I would say identity sea shanties 1.0.
So, what this whole conversation gets me thinking about, like, trust is really not a black and white issue, right? Because there are times where I have that low assurance requirement, access to a website to, get access to my son's baseball team's website. I will tell you, though, when it says, do you want to save this credit card? I'm like, heck no. Heck no, do I want to save my credit card on this website? But, just kind of that level of trust is not always the same whether you're talking about, high risk assets versus low risk assets that you're trying to access. And Lorraine Ald from the ID Pro Slack channel threw out a question. She wanted to get your thoughts on the NIST 863-C draft 4 or draft revision 4, which, is the level of assurance guideline from NIST. So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, and that's great. Great question. We've definitely been digging into it. We're not done digging into it. It's getting better and better, for sure. I referenced getting rid of the appendix from Rev 1. I think going to Rev 2, the whole thing about, well, make sure that it's, super strong bit strength, and then learned that wasn't, in the top 5 list of things we want to do. The initial thoughts that I have around ways to comment mostly have to do with um, finding ways to give guidance around that notion of fine-grained, contextual, adaptive, intelligent, dynamic assurance levels. And for a long time, I've called this LOA pie. Like, how do you get into the cracks of the keyboard when it comes to levels of assurance? Um, and figure out how to make it more dynamic. And um, that makes me, first of all, think AI as a technology and a technique you'd apply, and maybe we'll talk more about that. But I actually went over to talk with folks who are familiar with one of our UK government customers, who's kind of in the same boat as the customers, the direct customers of NIST, to say, well, do you have any recommendations? And what I learned was this particular UK government customer has what they call a transactional risking model, and I quite like it. And it goes into more depth on um, transactions and sessions, and on behavior, and on operational rules. And maybe that'll come by a Rev 7. I don't know. It's like something that they keep on deepening. But that's that whole kind of dynamicness is remains a hot topic. It will continue to be a hot topic.
So you mentioned AI, which is a hot button word for me. I'm a big fan of all the different tools that have come out and the democratization of being able to leverage technology like that. And you mentioned bias, and where are these tools being developed, trained on, right? It's being trained on, let's just take ChatGPT, right? We've been talking about this. We should just call it AI at the center at some point because we keep bringing it up. But ChatGPT has been, basically learning from the internet up through, I think, 2021 is what its data set is good for. And based on what it's been learning, there are still some questions around bias and where do you get answers from, and are they accurate, which I think is probably the most important thing. Is the data fact or not? I ran a little experiment on myself typing it in. It's like, tell me about me. First of all, it didn't know who I was. Like, all right, well, thanks, dude. So I then had to give it a couple more prompts. Okay, right. It's like, oh, I work at RSM. I host Identity Center. It's like, oh, that Jeff Stedman. Okay, great, cool. And then it started spitting out some stuff that some of it was not true. Apparently, I've been promoted, and I am a partner with RSM. So, Daniel,
Run
for
with
listening,
it.
thank you very much. Right? Yeah, exactly.
High
That's not
assurance
true.
data.
Yeah, exactly.
Verifiable
And then
credential.
me being part of other industry groups, identity ecosystem. I've never even heard of that thing. I certainly support IDSA, for example, but I'm not a member of it. And it just leads me down this path of, okay, well, I it's one of those things where I get so excited. It's like, oh, this is going to be so cool. And when we figure it out and when we can trust it, and that bias is still there, that lack of transparency of where the data is coming from. If it was something that's like, oh, well, this is where I pulled it from, for example, well, I can go and correct that piece of information. So it's not citing it, which I think is a little bit different than what Microsoft Bing has announced. And I'm in part of the beta, so I actually get to play around with the Chat GPT integration within the Bing search, which I would
does
never
that mean
use
you
Bing
know
search.
Sydney?
Yeah, so I know Sydney.
Right? Sydney. Wow.
Yeah, the code name.
Friend of Sydney.
And they have actually taken a pretty unique approach where they actually cite in the answer where they're pulling the information from. So it'll say, well, here's the answer. And then it'll give a little, footnote of say, okay, well, this part came from this website and this other part came from this other website. But you're still dealing with, okay, well, why did it pick that website versus another website? And that bias that exists. I'm just curious, where do you see this going from like a bias and a trust perspective on that AI side of the world? Because it seems like that's a little bit counter to what we want in security, which is this binary decision, right? Either you're good or you're bad. And there isn't a lot of flux in between.
I mean, I think it's possible, first of all, to answer the last little thing you said, it's possible for us to start answering those questions of you're in or you're out in a more fine-grained way, and to change our decision more often. And I think, there are different kinds of AI, and large language models are a kind of AI that, it's practically Mad Libs, right? It's filling in blanks, and it's using the data that started out, written by humans who may have been incorrect or lying or whatever. And so it's not meant for the purpose of being true. And we'd have to ask it to do a lot of things to assure ourselves that something is true. And there's a lot of usefulness even with that. I mean, there's plenty of, I don't know, junior reporters writing things, getting things wrong, and needing an editor, right? It's not so surprising. Um, the key, I think, you put your finger right on it, is there's a branch of AI literally called explainable AI, XAI for short. And I think it's really important, if at all possible, for adopters of AI technology to strive for explainability. There's another term, interpretability, which means more like, it's properly understood. If you think about like meaningful consent guidelines, it's sort of like that. Did somebody understand what you're telling it, where you got the information? So I think my colleague, Steve Venema, happened to just publish a really nice post on a ForgeRock community, so community.forgerock.com if you want to check it out, called Creating Trustworthy AI, as it happens. And he's partly relaying some of the good work that NIST has done here. So they have a special publication, 1270, towards a standard for identifying and managing bias in artificial intelligence and other work. So that special publication lays out a bunch of examples of concerning results in AI, and where we come down on the advice in that post is, yes, harm can be real. Familiarize yourself with explainable AI and interpretable AI. Of course, you have to make ethical management of consent around sharing data, using data, and the storage of data, the management, data governance, a guiding principle. And these are the sorts of things that will increase confidence in, I would say, really every kind of AI. And so the kind of AI that we specialize in, I would call it helps intelligent decisioning. And decisioning in identity is largely about authorization, although not always. It could be finer grained, like, um, you know, uh, allow them to cut a PO of this size, but not that size, or step up and test them harder if they try and do this other thing, or in circumstances that look suspicious. That is the kind of fine. It's like turning. I don't know. My CEO friend Raj talks about what seems like a dumb tool without that help can become a very smart tool. I mean, and even that needs explainability, and that's a stance, that's a principle that we uphold in what we do when you're doing any kind of decisioning, and you always want to be able to sort of bottom out with some sort of human oversight. So I recommend people take a look at that post just for just kind of an overview of the current state of the art, and get a little bit of advice.
Yeah, if you can send me the link, I'll be sure to add it to our show notes for people to check out.
Absolutely.
I had a question, and maybe this sounds stupid, but maybe it's not. Would we even recognize bias? How would we even recognize it?
I think it's quite difficult. There's the post relays some discussion there as well. They're from a different, I think, from a different NIST document, if I'm not mistaken, about the ways that people fool themselves. I mean, human beings are value judgment machines. So everything we do is intended to make patterns, see patterns, and quite often get it wrong, or just, the world is full of nuance for human beings and their brains. So there's some good advice about, sort of how not to fool yourself. And there's a concept this is actually in the rationalist community, which I sometimes frequent online. The concept is steel manning. Like a straw man argument is kind of like a straw argument is, well, it's too easy to knock down. That's no test at all. Steel manning is when you imagine all the best arguments for the thing that you hate, or vice versa. All the totally awful, killer arguments against the thing you love, and like do the work to steel your implementation against that, and then be transparent about what you found.
I could sit here and gripe about AI all day because and I do it all the time. But it feels like every call center you dial into these days is like answered by somebody or answered by an AI voice. I'm a person. I can understand complex questions. Send me to an operator. I want to talk to a person. Oh, no.
Zero.
Zero. And it's like, no, I can really help you. Just give me your question. Okay, well, I have questions about my bill. I'm sorry, I didn't understand that. It's like, okay, operator,
Oh,
I need
dear.
to speak. I'm going to pull my hair out. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, that is exactly, that's sort of like the vocal uncanny valley of, you just, if you have that level of suspicion going in, it doesn't help for them to keep going down that path, and they should just make it easy to get to a
Yeah.
human.
Well, I also think that it carries over to the next time you hear one of those system sensitive phones. So like poor implementation of technology just builds that lack of trust that you have for the technology. I guess
That
that's
can extend, as I think you're saying, it can extend to sort of, all service providers, to all retailers, to all everybody, maybe to all employers. I mean, it's a heavy burden, and it's why being modest in our aims is a good idea when we deploy systems.
I kind of feel like on the chat GPT front, I've heard a lot of people talk about like, hey, this could take away our jobs. But I actually think that where AI could flip the script is actually just make us more productive. Because I find myself doing like routine tasks over and over again throughout my day. And if I had some kind of true virtual assistant that could be automated, that it could just talk to me and I could tell it everything I need done and it could go and do it, I'd get huge value out of that. I'd be much more productive. I can spend my time
Yeah.
researching and getting smarter.
Yeah, I know. So a few months ago, I was starting to generate all my weird illustrations in my talks and my presentations using Dolly 2. And they do get more and more, I don't know, hallucinogenic. And and I was talking to somebody at work who's like, "Well, this is just an affront. That's not art." And I said, "Well, the same thing was said about photography in the beginning, just so you know." Um, I actually find a lot of creativity, and like people have already written novels and the illustrated graphic novels with some of these things, and like obviously the engine didn't come up with it itself. What comes after no code? This.
Right.
This is what comes after no code, and that's a new kind of democratization that it's uncomfortable for, the high priests of whatever do that thing. It's very comfortable for folks who want to be able to do it because there's a lot of folks who need the results. It's
Right.
beneficial.
Yeah. The
So
example I always hear is the electric light put people out of business who went around and lit street lights, but it didn't
yeah,
end humanity. I think that the potential of automation with AI, if all you do is repeatable mundane tasks, yes, I think it could. It's
yeah.
going to force you to get out of that business and do something that actually should be more empowering.
This
Well,
is, I mean, this is kind of
I don't think
creative
that's AI.
destruction, right? Yeah.
That's just automation, right? It's not
Yeah,
thinking for
it's just
itself and doing
automation. Well,
things.
and that's what we're talking about, right? I mean, it's a species of automating something, automating and scaling something, and those are very powerful things, and they can be used for ill as well as good. Um, and so, speaking of trusting all these things, how do we make these systems that are starting to become so powerful? How do we get a level of letting them do more rather than locking them down? And it's through explainability, interpretability, openness, transparency. That's the
So
first step.
before we completely go off the rails, I did want to hit this third area, which was trust in vendors. Again, perfect person to have on here because as somebody who's the CTO for a company that creates cybersecurity software, um, what is it that's needed to build trust in your company and what can destroy that trust?
Yeah. This is where I'm tempted to reach for that pyramid I was describing before again, because protection, transparency, and giving customers control, I think are all really good elements of achieving that trust. Lots of things can go wrong. I think everybody knows when you're using a software vendor, a SaaS vendor, whatever it is. It's understood that nothing is perfect. However, to maintain the relationship, you need to have unassailable transparency. You mentioned the consumer identity breach report that I'd come on and talked about at one point. One of the things that we were watching last year when we published, and we're working on the new one, this will be our fifth anniversary one, so stay tuned. But we were watching breach notification delays lengthen, even as we see mandates starting to encroach to make you do it. And the best way to be trustworthy is to have what I think in the open banking world they call this compete, not comply mindset. How do you become a leader in that openness? How do you become a leader in doing better? And I just think that's the best way.
For some reason, I feel like this is an area that companies just plain struggle with, is getting the breach notifications out, the transparency, whatever it may be. I just we've seen the playbook happen over and over and over again, where here's one that was handled okay. Everybody's going to get breached at some point, right? How you handle it, I think, is more important at this point, because back in my day, when you got breached, it was game over. Your company was done. Now it seems like everybody's getting breached for some reason, and it's not the the death knell that it used to be. But it just seems like every company sucks at handling breaches with the public. They're just not good at it.
Did you just say back in my day?
Back in my day, yes, I did. I pulled that out.
Get off my lawn. We had to parse uphill in the snow both ways. No, it's true that more companies are getting experience with it, and it's being sort of democratized in the sense of it's not just the mega corporations, having their bazillions of records breached. It's smaller players, smaller enterprises, and we showed this actually in our report last year. It is becoming a little bit like password knowledge, a fact of life, and I think what would really be killer is lack of good faith transparency. And I almost feel like everybody should just put out a dirty laundry report monthly just to get into the habit. It's making the same mistake twice. And it's making the wrong choice, whatever that might be in configuration or whatever, be the easiest choice for their customers. So there's some commitments that any company can make there and survive some bad storms.
I feel like one of the areas that creates a vulnerability in this respect is cloud delivered services. So identity as a service, for example. And I got to think this keeps IAM practitioners up at night, knowing that they've put trust in a company and that they may be running some software, for example, like the SolarWinds incident, right? I think that I'm not trying to pick on SolarWinds, but it's probably one of the biggest breaches of our career. And it was a supply chain incident that affected so many organizations. Well, now I'm putting so much trust in an identity as a service. They may be running software that gets hacked. They may get hacked themselves. What's the IAM practitioner to do?
It's funny. I guess I'll mention the breach report again, just because what we found last year was that supply chain attacks were up 297%. That's a big deal. And this is where, all right, I guess it's time for drinking. Zero trust architecture came up with, I mean, it is kind of right for us on a Friday. Not for the listeners. Maybe it is for the listeners. But it came up with this concept of the SBOM, the software bill of materials. And I really think that's a good idea because it sort of bespeaks this trend towards proper inventorying of everything. GDPR sort of requires proper inventorying of personal data, and that zero thing really is starting to require proper inventorying of like all the software that you're using in whatever guise. So I kind of feel like that is a way to start having that conversation. Obviously, general supply chain management and vendor management that's what it sort of comes down to. And it can learn the lessons actually of some of if you think about the Federation assurance level work in NIST, that allows for assessment of an IDP, could be of any sort of third party that you're working with, and accreditation of assessors and all the rest of it.
So there's so much going on in this space. I feel like we could talk for probably like hours. And I hear a little like dingling. Maybe that's Sabrina's collar
Oh,
or something. I don't know.
sorry. Yeah.
No, it's fine. I was really hoping this would be the time that we would get, the pet on cam and on the Identity Center podcast. But
It is a dog
you've
being fed, I think.
speaking of getting fed, it is a Friday night. Why don't we start to wrap things up so that you can get on with your weekend? I can get on with writing my statements of work, which is super exciting. But before we go, we do like to end on that lighter note. We're all going to be in Dallas area, Grapevine, Texas for Gartner in a few weeks. And that is your neck of the woods. So one, looking forward to actually being able to give you a fist bump in real life. But for the people who are, congregating down there who aren't from that area, what's a little known place that people should try to go out of their way to grab a bite to eat or a drink or something like that we should check out while we're there?
Yeah. Oh, there's a dog. You're hearing a dog.
Yeah, Sabrina.
I'm so excited people are going to be in my neck of the woods. And so I live really close to Grapevine. And of course, it's going to be at the Gaylord Texan. So it's I actually found out that the Gaylord Texan is the largest Gaylord. And for those who've been to the Gaylord Rockies, for Identiverse, that's the smallest Gaylord, just for the record. And so what I would love to recommend to everybody is if you want some good barbecue, and I'm going to say a good barbecue experience, then I do recommend Hard 8. There's one really not far. They keep the smokers going like 24/7, and you walk up and you order by the pound, and it's just a super cool experience. And I also love, there's a town called Carrollton, and it's got some amazing Korean food. It's also not far. And so if you're going to reach out and experience the general area, that's what I say you got to do.
Okay, well, you had me at 24-hour smoker, and I looked it up. Hard 8, as in the number, ocho, barbecue.
Yep.
So that's definitely going to be on the list for
I'm
sure.
going to start calling it the Ocho.
The Ocho, right.
Dodgeball.
Yeah, exactly. I'm glad you got the reference. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get things wrapped up. Eve, you've been generous as always with your time with us. Super appreciate it, you coming on, especially on a Friday night, and taking time out for us and sharing your wisdom with us and the listeners that are out there. I'll have links in our show notes to reach out to. You can connect with you on LinkedIn. There's Sabrina. Oh, what a good little pupper. Sorry, guys. This is audio only, but we finally got to see Sabrina. Yeah. So we'll have links in our show notes. You can connect with Eve on LinkedIn. We'll have a link to ForgeRock. I did find the CTO Lounge on the ForgeRock community website that actually has a few different articles on AI and stuff like that. So I'll put a link to that, and also explainai.org, so that if you're interested in sort of that area, you can kind of see what that's been working on. And of course, links for Jim and myself to connect on LinkedIn. If you are, looking for a very interesting conversation at Gartner, we're going to be on stage, talking with Enrique and Becky. Send us your deepest, darkest, hardest questions for Gartner. There's still time. Send it over to us. Send it to us via LinkedIn, and we'll try to identify some themes and include that for part of the discussion we'll have there. So we'll go ahead and leave it there for this week. You can find us on the web, identityatthecenter.com. We're also on Twitter at IDAC Podcast, and we'll go ahead and wrap it up there. Thanks everyone for listening, and we'll talk with you all in the next one.
You've been listening to Identity at the Center. We hope you've enjoyed the show. Make sure to like, rate, and review. And we'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hit the website at identityatthecenter.com and find us on Twitter at IDAC Podcast. See you next time on Identity at the Center.